All right, get started. Hello, my name is Sarah Lawson, and I'm a senior energy analyst at U.S. Agency for International Development. I work on global energy policy with a focus on renewable energy auctions. I'm happy to welcome you to today's webinar, Dispatchable Renewable Energy Auctions. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on the training page of the Scaling Up Renewable Energy website on usa.gov. We need creative approaches to power system design to enable us to bend emissions curves. Power systems with increasing shares of variable renewable energy require flexible demand and dispatchable generation. As prices for clean energy and energy storage technologies continue to fall, new opportunities to integrate higher shares of renewable energy are unlocked. Today, USAID's Scaling Up Renewable Energy program, also known as SHORE, will explore how auction design elements can incentivize renewable energy with energy storage solutions to increase system flexibility. Experts will compare the different approaches taken in India, Israel, Chile, and South Africa. We hope this webinar will be helpful as you weigh the inclusion of storage and other dispatchable resources in your power systems. A few housekeeping items to mention before we begin. Please write any questions you may have in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we will address them at the end during the Q&A. You may also click the button to raise your hand so that we can unmute your mic during the Q&A. The webinar will include 4 sections. The first is the definition of dispatchable renewable energy. The second is its relevance in the conversation. The third are country experiences. The fourth is lessons learned, and then we will discuss, we'll have a Q&A and a discussion section. Today's presenters include Fabian Vicand, who has more than 13 years of experience in energy sector strategy, markets, and regulation. He is an expert on energy procurement and power sector reform and has advised international organizations and investors on energy auctions in more than 20 countries. Since 2015, he has been a lead researcher at the EU Horizon 2020 ORAS research project on renewable energy auctions. Ana Amazo is an expert in policy incentives for renewable energy, including market and system integration. She has led projects for governments and investors and designed renewable energy auctions in more than 10 countries in Asia, Europe, and Africa. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Fabian.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I'm happy to be here. Let's start with the definition of dispatchable renewable energy. And if you go to the next slide, you see a brief overview. So dispatchable renewable energy is a renewable energy plant that can adjust its power output supplied to the electricity grid on demand. So this can include a single dispatchable renewable energy source, such as biomass or hydro, or, and this combination is a bit newer, a combination of a variable renewable energy plant, such as wind and solar, with a dispatchable energy source, for example, with battery storage, with storage hydro, or with a dispatchable thermal plant. And thereby the variable renewable energy plant becomes dispatchable itself. How is this dispatchability put to use? It is used for meeting system energy needs. For example, peaking energy in times when the variable renewable energy would usually not produce power, for example, for solar and storage in the evening, or for ancillary and balancing services to stabilize the grid. Interesting is that recently dispatchable renewable energy auctions have evolved quite a lot. Until a few years ago, they were rather rare, and if they would take place, we would see usually dispatchable renewable energy auctions with only a few hours of dispatchability per day. But recently, dispatchable renewable energy auctions have been much more ambitious. So, for example, they aim to provide dispatchability several times of a day, or even the entire night as well, and also more frequently dispatchability in the course of the day. It is really important to tailor dispatchability of the plant to the system needs and the cost of alternatives. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the more dispatchability or the longer the better. You really have to make it fit to the system. And if you go on the next slide, you can see in one more, basically see the relevance of dispatchable renewable energy. Overall, of course, I mean, the question is pretty simple, and I'm sure you've come around a lot, is that basically simply higher shares of renewables also mean higher power system requirements and higher requirements for integration. And that's becoming even more important because we're currently witnessing really a fundamental transformation of the energy system. So to reach net zero emissions by 2050, the share of variable renewable energy in the power system is increasing a lot. IRENA forecasts that 60% of generated electricity by 2050 will actually come from variable renewable energy. But with high shares of variable renewable energy, the shape of the net load profile is also changing. And this increases then system requirements for balancing supply and demand. How much flexibility is needed, that depends a lot on the gradual increase of renewable energy in the power system. So basically, the more higher shares of renewables you have, the more you need flexibility services, but also on the character of the power system. So it really depends on the country setup, right? On the supply and demand patterns in the country, on the size of the country. For larger countries, larger systems, it's easier to integrate fluctuating renewables because they also have higher variability of supply. Then also of the interconnection with neighbors, right? If you're strongly connected with neighbors, it's really more easy for you to integrate fluctuating renewables. And then in the end, on the market and regulation itself in the country. It's also important to note that the source of flexibility will come from different sectors and from different technology solutions, and dispatchable renewable energy will have an important role to play, but by far not the only. But let's look on the next slide for another interesting trend for dispatchable renewable energy, and that is simply because it's getting much cheaper. Recent auctions have shown very promising prices, and you will learn some more on the deep dives later on from my colleague Anna Maaßen. Record low prices, for example, were achieved with only $15 to $24 per megawatt hour in 2021 in Chile, or only $28 per megawatt hour in 2021 also in Israel. On the right table, you can see some further auction results from 2021 from dispatchable renewable energy plants around the world. And I think these are very compatible prices already. It's important to note, of course, we currently see with storage as with other technologies, often that supply chain problems can increase really big prices on the short term, but I think we still see this really strong trend for overall technology learning, achieving scale and levelized cost of electricity and auction prices going down a lot for dispatchable renewables. It's also important to note that these prices are already considerably cheaper in most countries than the cost of alternative dispatchable fossil fuel-based generation. Of course, currently with the global energy crisis and both prices for gas going extremely up, but also of coal going up, this data would even look stronger. But even if we take this maybe as temporary situation, if we just look at the 2021 prices, we already see that the current that basically the pre-crisis prices for gas, both for gas peakers and in many cases also for combined cycle gas plants, were higher than dispatchables plus renewables. So this is a promising development, and on the next slide you can see a bit more on what that means for renewable auctions overall. So it's important to note that yes, the price for dispatchable renewables is going down, but it should not always be the default solution, right? Sometimes in other cases, simple renewable energy auctions would also be applicable and a good idea, because it's important that it's not always the cheapest one, right? So I think it's important that not all renewable energy auctions should evolve automatically with renewables plus storage auctions, and that renewable energy plus storage can be targeted as a more kind of transitional solution to procure flexibility, particularly if there's no ancillary service market around. Other sources for flexibility are on the duration side, for example, pumped hydro, but also demand response, renewable energy curtailment in some cases where you shut down renewables power plants to take pressure off the grid, and then power trade with neighbors. I think to identify how much renewables plus storage, or how much dispatchability from dispatchable renewable energy plants you would need in the system, and when it makes economic sense, we really suggest and want to highlight the importance of an integrated resource assessment and of energy planning that really help you to find the right and the most cost-efficient mix of sources and instruments. And by the way, the USAID Scaling Up Renewable Energy project, the project we're presenting from, is also providing a lot of guidance on that. But before we talk about that, let's look a bit further into some more case studies of successful dispatchable renewable energy procurements and how they were designed around the world. And by the way, I see that somebody has raised the hand for a question. If that's okay, we basically present first, and then in the end, we will have plenty of time for question and answers. But thank you so much. And now I hand over to Anna to continue the presentation.
Thanks, Fabian, for that helpful overview. I would like now to present a summary of experiences with dispatchable RE, including the use case for application for which dispatchable RE was used, key auction design elements to incentivize it, auction prices, and some of the key factors that help explain those prices without going into a deep dive. We'll talk about auctions in India, Israel, Chile, and South Africa. Let's start with the experience in India. Next slide. When looking at a country example for dispatchable RE, it is very important to look at the specific transaction because they are done under very market and regulatory framework conditions and with different objectives. India is a country that has auctioned large volumes of solar PV and wind, and since 2018-2019, they have also implemented auctions for round-the-clock or 24/7 supply of power, also known as RTC, as well as solar and wind hybrids and other system-friendly type of auctions. One example of those types of auctions is the 2020 peak power auction, which sought to contract dispatchable RE to cover peak demand. Distribution companies, which are in this case the buyers of that electricity, face the challenge of arranging power during high demand periods, for example, during the evening, when no or little RE is available. Authorities designed an auction with a two-part tariff, a peak tariff for high demand time blocks, and an off-peak tariff for the low demand time blocks. The off-peak tariff was fixed at approximately $38 per megawatt hour, while the peak tariff was discovered through competitive bidding in the auction. The auction was technology neutral, which allowed developers the option of using a portfolio of technologies that delivered energy at the least cost. How to incentivize this? The auction defined a capacity utilization factor, also known as CUF, to ensure that a minimum quantity of electricity was available yearly for off-takers. In this case, it was a capacity utilization factor of 35% of the total potential capacity of an installation. The tender specified penalties if the CUF, or this minimum supply obligation, failed by more than the 50% minimums, so below that 35%, as a way to ensure that the quality of the electricity was provided as required by distribution companies. This auction awarded two projects at an average peak price of $83 per megawatt hour, one for a project with pumped storage and one project with battery storage. Combined, the levelized peak and off-peak tariff was in the range of $54 to $57 megawatt hour. And this was in 2020. If we look at the results, it is key to consider that India is an example of a country that has implemented a series of auctions, and this has allowed them to discover competitive prices. At the time of the auction, this result was regarded as a success by distribution companies given that the cost of purchase for thermal power, for new thermal power plants, was $70 to $90 per megawatt hour, and the average cost of purchase of power for discoms at the time was in the range of 50 to 60 megawatt hours, which makes a 54 to 57 levelized tariff for this peak supply projects, something that becomes attractive. One aspect to note, though, is that to further encourage even more competitive prices, it is important to get more precise data from demand forecasting that allows you to define a higher level of resolution of sorts for the peak period. So in this case, there was a 9-hour peak block defined. And from those 9 hours, producers had to supply during 6. What could make those, one factor that could make those prices more competitive would be to define shorter peak times that are more in line with what, for example, battery storage can, with commercially available technologies, can competitively provide. Next slide. We move now to the experience in Israel. The needs of a country like Israel are, of course, very different than that of India, not only in terms of power system size, but also because Israel is an energy island. This means its power grid is not connected to the systems of neighboring countries, so its TSO, or system operator, needs to balance power demand and supply within country. The use case for dispatchable RE in Israel was to support the integration of a planned massive increase in solar PV capacities. In 2021, solar PV capacity stood at 3.4 gigawatts, and it is planned that it should reach 12 gigawatts by 2030. So a bit less than 4 times in 8 years. In this case, the idea is for the TSO to use that storage capacity as its discretion for a variety of purposes. The design of the auction requires that projects have 4 hours of energy storage capacity to be available per each megawatt of installed, per megawatt of allocated grid capacity. So if 10 megawatts of capacity are allocated in the auction, then 40 megawatt hours then need to be available in energy storage capacity. The TSO can request 1 cycle of discharge of this energy storage per day, and it is likely that this will be during peak demand hours in the evening. The auction also allows developers to decide on the install capacity for the PV system and the battery capacity, for the PV system. It's basically, it makes it up for them in terms of project configuration, other than this 4 hours of energy storage requirement. The auctions awarded projects at remarkably low prices, as low as $28 per megawatt hour in the most recent auction, as my colleague Fabian mentioned. If we look at the results in the 3 rounds that have taken place, we see that there is indeed a price decrease across the rounds, starting with $64 per megawatt hour and reaching $28 per megawatt hour in the most recent auction. And from this, we can say that planning several rounds, given that visibility to the market instead of having a one-off auction, it's important to support competition, but we should be careful not to conclude that auction prices always decline from round to round, since country experience shows that after several rounds, they tend to stabilize. A key thing to consider here is that in Israel, there is not yet a day-ahead electricity market, nor a market for ancillary services. So for a producer, the revenue stream is fixed since it comes only from the fixed price defined in the 23-year PPA awarded in the auction. This means that there is a projectable revenue stream, which potentially helps improve the bankability of the project, of those projects that are financed via project finance, since there is no risk from market price volatility. Next slide, please. Right now, next we'll talk about Chile, and this is again a widely known example. Chile has been running auctions 3 rounds since 2017, and the goal here, it's a bit different from the previous 2 examples in terms of peak power supply and peak power supply and any other services that TSO might need. In here, the goal is to guarantee supply to distribution companies. The regulator, who is the auctioneer, aggregates demand projections for the next 10 years from the distribution companies, who are the buyers in this case, and conducts the auction. The auction defines supply blocks, each with its own energy requirements. So these supply blocks can be for intraday or seasonal supply, like in the 2017 auction, or it can be only for intraday supply, like in the 2021 and 2022 tenders. If you take a look at the graph, you can see the 2021 supply blocks, and there are 3 of them along a 24-hour period. Block A covers a period between 11 p.m. and 8 a.m. Block B between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. And lastly, Block 1C from 6 p.m. until 11 p.m. Bidders in this case can choose to bid in one of the supply blocks or for all of them. For example, a solar PV without storage and maybe a producer with just the one project in their portfolio can choose to bid in the daily block, so the 1B, to match the generation profile of the solar PV plant. The contract awarded in this type of auction is significantly shorter than in the India and the Israel examples at 15 years. Like the India example, the Chile auction is technology agnostic, with the difference that also conventional power capacities can compete. So renewables and conventional power plants compete head to head. In the 2017 auction, there were some gas projects awarded, but both in the 2021 and the 2022 auction rounds, the entire supply volume was awarded to projects combining solar PV, wind, and storage. Chile, like India and Israel, has implemented several rounds and seen competitive prices, starting with $33 in average per megawatt hour in 2017, and reaching as low as $24 per megawatt hour in average again in 2021. We see, though, that in the 2022 auction, the average price went up to $37 per megawatt hour. And the reason was that there was not a lot of participation in the auction. In the end, the authority only awarded 14% of the intended auction volume to 2 bidders. So this again showcases that price developments in auction not always follow a declining path, but it is let's say, conducive to competition to give that visibility to the market so that developers can prepare pipelines in the countries. One distinguishing feature of Chile compared to the other examples we've seen today is that they have a spot market, and this allows producers to place really competitive bids across supply blocks, including during Block 1C, which covers the evening peak. The strategy adopted by some of the producers is to place aggressive bids for the auction for only a modest share of the total power plant output, and then for the remaining output of that given plan, they sign contracts with large consumers, also known as the contracts known as corporate PPAs, or by selling at the spot market at peak hours, at peak hours for, well, obtaining higher prices. And lastly, another element that contributed to the very low prices observed in Chile is the fact that they define relatively long project realization deadlines, which allow bidders to speculate on lower costs on equipment, logistics to materialize closer to the commissioning deadline. In the 2021 auction, the commissioning deadline was defined at 2026, so a 5-year realization deadline for these projects. Next slide, please. Again, another well-known case is South Africa. Their auction program has been implemented since 2011, has had 5 rounds for technology-specific renewables, and have succeeded in achieving competitive prices, as well as promoting economic development goals. In early 2021, South Africa conducted a technology-neutral auction, so different than the technology-specific auctions in the past. A technology-neutral auction that only excluded coal power plants. In this auction, known as a risk mitigation auction, aimed to close a generation capacity gap that the authorities identified in their integrated resource plan, and was estimated to be about 2 gigawatts of capacity lacking in the coming years, which risk leading to a lot of load shedding. The auction defined a rather long 13-hour supply block between 5 a.m. and 9 p.m. And the bid prices, bids were evaluated 90% on price, 10% on economic development goals, and the bid prices offered represented several payment streams. One bid could be for 1 or more power plants, and these power plants could either be co-located or they could be located in different sites. All of this to meet the requirement to be able to generate at the awarded capacity at any time of the day. We noticed that the auction defined a very short realization deadline of about 1 year and offered a 20-year PPA. We recently, last time, checking recently, saw that some projects are facing delays in reaching financial close, not only from the risk mitigation auction program, but actually from the most recent technology-specific renewable round. And from the projects awarded in the risk mitigation auction, the project with combining PV and storage began construction earlier in July in this year. So if we take a look at the results, the 2 gigawatts of dispatchable capacity intended were indeed awarded, and winners include for about 1.6 gigawatts gas plants, and the rest is split between oversized renewable capacities combined with battery storage and smaller amounts of fossil fuels. All of this, again, to meet the very high requirements of dispatchability along this 13-hour block. Again, the project that began construction in July is the one project awarded that does not include fossil fuel capacities, and it's a hybrid of oversized PV capacities and battery storage. It secured a price of $140 per megawatt hour, and one factor we noticed is that this higher price compared to the prices, for example, obtained in other geographies, can be partly explained because of a longer 13-hour block that it has to meet. So if you compare that to, for example, the 4-hour period during which, for example, battery storage can compete on cost with other dispatchable power sources, then it shines some light in terms of why you observe some of these high prices. Again, not the only factor. It's important not to compare the prices of one country directly with another, but just intend it as a reference here. Next slide, please. So that was a rather fast-paced overview on 4 interesting country experiences. And before we wrap up this webinar, we wanted to sum up the dispatchable RE opportunity. Fabian explained that dispatchable generation can be procured from different mechanisms, such as direct procurement, or from markets such as ancillary services markets. We noticed that dispatchable RE can have a role to play in both countries with and without these markets. So it's not really an either-or question. In countries without ancillary services markets, direct procurement can be tested via auctions in order to support the integration of variable renewables such as solar PV and wind without storage. The auction contract, so the PPA, provides incentives for system services that are otherwise not provided by standalone PV and wind. One consideration in countries without ancillary services and testing direct procurement for dispatchable RE is the importance of evaluating storage, including battery storage, against other flexibility sources, for example, as part of an exercise of energy planning in the form of an integrated resource planning. In countries with ancillary services markets, there can still be a role for direct procurement, and we actually observe it that in geographies with developed markets, auctions do include some of these dispatchable RE components in their programs. In those cases, the auction can ensure there's a minimum price for producers for the provision of this flexible generation. The PPA in this case acts as a sort of anchor revenue to other market revenue streams, which can also be attractive from a project financing perspective, since it helps manage merchant risk, so the risk of market price volatility. In this case, direct procurement enables the buying of electricity, so the buying of a product that is more tailored to the needs of the buyer, and it's perhaps not defined as a product yet in the market, in the ancillary services market. Again, a key consideration in countries with these markets is to ensure that dispatchable RE can also participate in those markets, so as to not rob the market, in this case, of potential volumes that could be feeding into those markets and increase their liquidity. Next slide, please. And with that, we would like to wrap up with a quick summary of lessons learned before opening the Q&A. And let's start by saying that our dispatchable RE has become cheap enough to become a component of an RE procurement program. It pays off to clearly define the timing and the rather shorter duration of peak periods, so to ensure that storage can provide the most, could be a competitive source of dispatchable power. Also, dispatchable RE should only be a component of a renewable program, given that there are cheaper sources of flexibility. Storage is often not the lowest cost option for dispatchable capacity, and it should be therefore combined with other approaches, such as expanding balancing areas with neighboring countries, increasing trade, etc. One-off auctions, like I guess in also technology-specific auctions, should be avoided because competitive prices are usually achieved by running a series of auctions that allow the market and the authorities to learn. And lastly, evolution is part of an auction program. Although there are good practices in design, there is no static or perfect auction design. Design needs to change and evolve depending on the results and objectives as the authorities review them. I'll stop here and give the screen back to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna and Fabian. Great presentation and country examples. I just wanted to check. I see somebody has had their hand up for a while, so we open the Q&A. Dimka Hughes, would you like to ask a question? Maybe is it a real hand? Oh, I think she might be gone from the attendee list. That's fine. I also saw a question from Susan Smith. Susan, did you want to ask your question verbally or should we read it?
Hi, Sarah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I found my question, so I can ask it. Yeah, I was just curious to hear the thoughts of the panelists. Thanks, first of all, really interesting presentation. I think you touched on this a little bit, but just to be more explicit about it, some of the pros and cons of designing auctions for dispatchable renewable energy, specifically this kind of hybrid auction approach versus doing a standalone storage auction. Do we have evidence on whether this approach might lead to overall lower costs? I think you touched on some of the other benefits we might see, and what are some of the conditions in which we ought to consider this approach? Thanks.
Thanks, Susan.
Yeah,
Fabio?
I can maybe take that one first. I think it's a good question because I think we've seen both recently. I think we have seen a bit more hybrid plans where basically we have renewables plus storage, but we also saw standalone storage, for example, in Italy, in the US, in France, partly Australia. And I think it really depends on what you want to, what's the priority of this dispatchable plant, right? I mean, so I think we presented there can be a multitude of application cases, from basically providing ancillary services to simply providing power during the peak hours, or to ensure that maybe distribution and transmission grid investment can be deferred, or it's easier to certain lines don't have to be strengthened. And I think based on that, you can really see what makes most sense, right? So, for example, we see that many cases countries that were particularly interested in having firm power. So also it's partly with the idea to maybe substitute the build of a bit of a new firm thermal power plant with a renewables plant to basically really go for a hybrid approach to ensure that there is firm power. And we can see, for example, in India and in Thailand and some others. I think in countries where it was important to defer grid strengthening alone, we see that sometimes these storage units might not be placed actually at the renewables plants themselves, but maybe more strategically somewhere else in the grid, right? Maybe next to a substation or large hydro dam and so on. So it really depends on what you want to achieve. I think the case where we have seen most standalone battery storage auctions is in the case of capacity markets, or I think was the case for Italy or for France and partly also the US, where basically the idea was, these storage solutions should also be able to participate in capacity markets, and therefore in these cases we often had then standalone solutions. So it depends a bit on what you want to achieve. I think it's difficult to compare them price-wise because the selection of countries is so different in terms of renewables resources and length of storage, like hours of dispatchability they chose and so on. But I think it really depends on the application case. And I think if you're really going for maybe more ancillary service approach, more aiming to reduce containment, more aiming at firmer generation, then you might be more inclined to use a hybrid approach, so renewables plus storage. If you're going for more kind of in the participation in capacity markets, if you have them, or deferring transmission grid investments, then you might go more for a standalone approach, but usually both is possible.
Thanks, Fabian. I also see a hand up from Pepin. Pepin, would you like to ask your question?
Hello? Can you
Yeah.
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
My question, I'm Pepin here, Pepin Trotte from ESI, Data Tech. My question, if I am in the shoes of a government decision maker somewhere in Africa, and I want to know what are the preconditions for the electricity market in my country to accept dispatchable renewable energy, what will be your advice? How do I make my country attractive for that? Thank you.
Want to go with that, Anna, or should I go?
I can give it a go.
Mhm.
Hi, Pepin. So your question is how to attract investors to provide dispatchable RE in a country. I think that the key element is to first off start with a clear incentive. If you are implementing a direct procurement or an auction, start with a clear incentive of how you're going to pay for that dispatchable RE. Do you need that dispatchable electricity for a peak period? Do you need it to help your electricity system with frequency regulation? And then reflect that into design, for example, in the form of time of generation tariffs, a higher peak tariff compared to an off-peak tariff. You can also reflect it in the form of capacity payments, so that so your system is available to react to provide frequency regulation. That on the specific auction design. Now, from a broader perspective, auction programs that are successful in attracting bidders, both for dispatchable RE or for other renewable technologies, are those that start with a simple design and ensure that there is visibility for the market in terms of future rounds, so that it is worth the while of the investor to go and move into a new country and start developing a project pipeline. Would you like to add anything, Fabian?
I think that was a good answer. Maybe looking at the other questions, Sarah, I could answer the one from Leopold, where he's asking basically to clarify if auction prices are affected by the amount of firm energy the system requires. And the answer is yes. So the longer you would like to have, so basically the storage is expensive, right? And it makes a difference whether you have 4 hours of storage added to a plant, or 8 or 16 or 2. And I think it's really important to optimize the amount of storage you require really to your system needs. And we would usually see that while recently, because storage prices have gone down so much, we actually see longer dispatchability provisions. So suddenly, maybe you said in the beginning, often it used to be maybe only for 1 peak, and now these days maybe you use it twice already, use it for a morning peak and the evening peak. But you really have to make sure that you don't overdo it. And I think an example for that would be recent auction results in South Africa, where I think rather long storage requirements were there. And do you know by any chance the exact amount of hours of storage required? Because it was rather long compared to other countries.
So exactly, it wasn't the storage, but Fabian, it was the supply clock. It was 13 hours versus other geographies that require maybe 4 or 6.
So I think the answer could be yes. So basically you would have to make sure, because the higher the firm energy requirements, the more you ask for dispatchability in your plant, the more expensive it could become. So yeah, make sure that you really tailor the hours of storage you provide to the system need.
I also see a question from Pascal Atta on case studies from West Africa. I don't think that we have any available. I'll ask Fabian and Anna too, but we do have some Power Africa colleagues that are in this webinar. So if they have any that they want to share, feel free to raise your hand. Fabian and Anna, are you aware of any? Obviously, we have the scaling solar auction that was in Senegal, but that didn't include storage. It's the only one I can think of offhand. Yeah,
me neither. I know that a couple of countries are interested in it. I know that I think Malawi has been looking into storage auctions and some others as well. I mean, I think particularly this can of course become very interesting also for more kind of cases where you don't have strong transmission capacity, right? So I think for more kind of off-grid solutions as well. But fully for utility scale storage, I haven't come across that yet, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but at least there hasn't been very prominent, and I don't think they've taken pace already. Maybe they're planned.
Malawi is not in West Africa, but Pascal, did you have any specific countries you were asking about? Do you want to come off mute? I see you're off mute, but we can't hear you if you're speaking. All right. Feel free to put any comments you have in the chat. Sorry about that. I see a question from Andre from Sinar. Would you like to come off mute? Oh, a little hard to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you, yeah.
Very sorry, it took some time to put my headset. So my question, in fact, is related to the context of the country I worked in, Indonesia. And in this country, the renewable energy is really, well, at the early stage. And the biggest worry of this country is being able to manage intermittent renewable energy. Dispatchable renewable energy would probably be very interesting, but they're still worried about the price. The condition of the market are not really good, and the government is not willing very much to provide any kind of support, sovereign support for these projects. I would like to understand what are, in that kind of situation, what are exactly the critical other points we could insist on to promote dispatchable renewable energy, knowing that the government is a bit reluctant, well, a lot reluctant to implement renewable energy, despite very, I would say, ambitious goal for the next 10 years. Thanks.
I can give it a go. So yeah, Andre, thank you for that question. I think maybe before diving into the bankability aspects, again, a reminder that for a country to test dispatchable RE, it's important to consider that it's really only a component. So I think it will be a disservice, for example, in the case of Indonesia, that all of the capacity that has been lagging, for example, in the pipeline, waiting finally for a clear signal of an auction or any sort of incentive to require that to have a dispatchable requirement to integrate that electricity. But moving to the bankability aspect, yes, I think it is not the only country that doesn't like or doesn't want to give a sovereign guarantee. There are, let's say, softer measures, and probably you have heard of them. For example, letters of credit from the letters of credit that the buyer gets with a certain amount of PPA payments to ensure the minimum payment to producers. Perhaps even more innovative concepts that combine concessional finance with private finance in the form of a fund, whereby, for example, a fund is the one that borrows from a development finance institution, and then it is that fund that can potentially lend to project finance projects in the country. From a PPA perspective, it is really about ensuring revenue stability in terms of the quantity of electricity that is off-taken to actually be off-taken, and in terms of the price. So in terms of the off-take risk, again, it would be key to include a clause that if the off-taker is not comfortable with something like take or pay, to at least define for example, a percentage of hours in the year or a bank of hours in the year that will not be compensated in case there is curtailment. In the case of the price paid, well, both, again, we come back to this letter of credit concept, but it's also about factors that affect that price that is paid in domestic currency, but maybe the debt is in hard currency. Again, balancing, because ultimately it is the consumer that will be going to pay for the costs of currency depreciation and inflation. Then again, it's a balancing act. It could be worth thinking to offer some level of comfort to lenders if the upside is that you get very competitive prices for power purchase agreements that lasts maybe 15, 20 years. So it's a balancing act, I guess.
Anna, I did just want to ask one question that we've been getting a lot from the field about disruptions in the supply chain. So we've seen, obviously, we're in a pandemic. We know that there are issues, procuring battery storage, solar PV, and wind. So do you think countries should hold off from starting dispatchable renewable energy auctions?
Well, let me start with, I'm happy to be challenged, but I'm going to say no. And the reason is that it takes a long time to before you decide to do an auction until you launch it. So a lot of the dynamics that are seen in the market, either the developers are going to find ways to better deal with them in their projects. But I guess the question here is, yes, there has been supply chain disruptions that have led to cost increases. But the overall trend is that it hasn't undone what has happened in the past 10 years. And these disruptions are going to be temporary. So at some point, things will stabilize, and it'll be a shame for a country to, again, put off from starting an auction. And it doesn't have to be in massive quantities, but to put off starting with an auction program that could kickstart really the commissioning of new capacity at better prices compared to what they have in the market, and sometimes even needed capacities from a resource adequacy perspective. But yeah, Fabian, if you have another view, please.
I would strongly support that point, because I mean, look also at the alternatives right now, right? I mean, usually you're basically directly competing with gas peakers. We know about the global gas price increase. They have felt differently in different regions, but overall, I mean, it rather increased the business case for battery storage. And I think one of the current price increase is that we don't just have the supply chain difficulties, but we also have a bit of a run on storage. And therefore, it really makes sense for you if you want to go be even more attractive alternative to really high gas prices, also for the coming years. So don't wait.
So thanks so much to our presenters, and thank you to the participants for all your questions. Feel free to follow up with me if you're from USAID, or you can follow up with us directly too through the website if you're not. So if you could take a brief evaluation survey, you'll find the link in the chat. We'll also send you an email with the survey link, and that'll help us to improve future webinars. And this link, the recording will be posted to the SHORE website, which is on usa.gov/energy/SHORE. Feel free to go on that website and check out this and lots of other auctions resources that can help you design an auction program. So thanks everybody and have a great day.